I've had the hobby of genealogy since I was in grade school. I've come to see family relationships as a watershed rather than a tree. Consider all the streams of ancestors that combine to make up the river that is you. They reach all the way back, up into the hominid mountains way in the distant past. And as each ancestor's trickle, or rivulet, or brook, or stream passes through the landscape of time, it gets to add some particles of silt from that landscape. They could be DNA, and parental guidance, and education, and cultural influences, and outside events. All of that becomes part of the stream that you inherit and pass on with your silt to your descendants down in the delta of your watershed. Family history, therefore, is so much more than blood. It is history itself.
For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of the ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage, fathers of time, daughters of dust, sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy, brothers of love, lovers of light, and builders of nations. We're seekers of truth and keepers of faith, makers of peace, wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of the ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We're mothers of courage and fathers of time. We're daughters of dust and sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy and brothers of love. We're lovers of light and builders of nations. We're seekers of truth and keepers of faith. We're makers of peace and wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of the ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are one.
My mother, Nancy M. Goddard, used to tell me to watch for connections because, she said, everything is connected. This is especially true for history, and my hobby of genealogy makes history very connected to me. Today I want to outline some of the historical events that my New England ancestors participated in. These are the three families I'll be talking about: the English Bradleys and the Scotch-Irish Smiths and McClintocks. Let's start with the Bradleys, who were the first to emigrate. France and England were in a race to colonize this part of North America. The French founded Quebec City in 1608. The English founded Portsmouth, Rye, Dover, and the other towns around the Great Bay in New Hampshire about 1623. Massachusetts Bay Colony founded Salem and Gloucester in 1626 and Boston in 1630. The French settled Montreal in 1642. The Winthrop fleet in 1630 signaled the start of the Great Migration. This was an emigration of English Puritans to New England area, and it went on from 1630 till a little after 1640. My ancestor, Daniel Bradley, was part of the Great Migration. He emigrated from Bingley in Yorkshire, England, in 1635. And he came to Rowley, Massachusetts Bay Colony. If your eyes are sharp, you will see that this old map does not have Rowley in the right place, but he went to the real Rowley, and a few years later he moved upriver to Haverhill, Massachusetts, on the frontier. What happened to the people who were here before the Great Migration, the Abenakis? Well, increasing numbers of settler colonists pushed them out of Massachusetts Bay and New Hampshire. The English Civil War, 1642, put an end to the Great Migration. It was basically the Protestant parliamentarians versus the Royalist Anglicans and Catholics. It took place primarily in British Isles, but in Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth Colony and Rhode Island, King Philip's War in 1675 to 76 took everybody's attention. It was the bloodiest conflict ever in North America based on the proportion of combatants on either side who were killed. As a result of King Philip's War, there was ethnic cleansing, and the Abenakis were cleansed from New England by the English. They went up to Canada, and they established a town on the St. Lawrence River, which they called Odanak. It was near the St. Francis mission of the French. In order to push back on the English colonists, the French incited the Abenakis to raid the English settlements. And of course, the Abenakis, who had lost their homes, were easily enrolled to do that. So in Haverhill, on the frontier, there were almost yearly raids from 1689 to 1708, 20 years worth. In 1689, the Abenakis raided Haverhill, and my immigrant ancestor Daniel Bradley was killed at the age of 76. In 1790, the next year, Haverhill established a number of garrison houses, and Daniel's son Joseph Bradley was in command of one. In 1697, there was a raid, and Joseph Bradley's wife Hannah was captured and taken to Montreal, which was the usual fate of the captives who survived a raid. In that same raid, another Hannah, my Hannah's neighbor, Hannah Dustin, was captured. She escaped from her captors in a bloody incident and came back to Haverhill as a hero throughout New England. But my ancestor Hannah Bradley, up in Montreal, had to be ransomed and brought home by her husband. In 1704, there was another raid, and Joseph's wife Hannah was captured again and taken to Canada again. This time, Joseph Bradley got together a keg of snuff, and he walked to Canada with the keg of snuff, and he ransomed Hannah Bradley back and brought her home again. In 1706, there was another raid, and Hannah shot an attacker rather than to be captured and taken to Canada a third time. In 1708, Joseph Bradley's niece Ruth was killed. And then from 1712, for about 10 years, peace reigned in the region. Now for the first of the Scotch-Irish families, the Smiths. In 1609, the English decided to colonize Ireland. They established what they called the Plantation of Ulster, and Protestant settler colonists from the Scottish lowlands were moved into the northern part of Ireland and displaced the native Irish. Naturally, there was a lot of friction, and in 1689, there was an Irish rebellion that involved all of the Protestant settlers being driven into the city of Londonderry, the walled city. There was a siege which lasted for 4 months, and the settlers had to starve or subsist on vermin before the siege was raised, and the cause of the English and the Protestants prevailed. However, the English administration did not really appreciate the contributions that the Scottish Protestants had made to their plantation of Ulster, so they changed the laws which discriminated against the Presbyterian Scots colonists. The Scots began to emigrate, and one of the places they came to was New England. The first 20 families came to Boston in 1719, but the Bostonians didn't want them. So they moved to Haverhill, and the Haverhill people didn't want them. So they got pushed beyond the frontier up north into Nutfield, New Hampshire, which is now called Londonderry. Lieutenant Thomas Smith, my ancestor, immigrated to Portsmouth and got a charter to be a grantee of Chester, New Hampshire in 1720. In 1724, Abenaki and French raiders captured him, but he escaped. He got back to Chester, and subsequently, several years later, he moved west and founded New Boston, New Hampshire, 1733. The French and Indian War, which really broke out in earnest in 1754, was an offshoot of the European Imperial War between France and Britain. They called it the 7 Years' War over there. We were involved in the French and Indian War. Thomas Smith's son, John Smith of New Boston, served in some capacity. And since I don't know exactly what capacity, I found a lovely picture of Fort Carillon, as the French called it, or Ticonderoga, as the English called it, which was a hot point in the French and Indian War. Another significant episode in the French and Indian War was the destruction of the Abenaki town of Odanak in 1759 by Rogers Rangers. Rogers Rangers were commando units in the British Army, consisting mostly of New England men. They destroyed Odanak in order to eliminate the French allies, but also as vengeance for 75 years of French and Abenaki raids on the New England frontier. If you want to see a graphic representation of the massacre of Odanak, you can watch Spencer Tracy's Northwest Passage film. It's kind of violent. No, it's very violent. It's based on the first half of Kenneth Roberts' book, Northwest Passage. Thomas Smith's grandson, John Smith, again, this time of Francistown, John Smith of Francistown served in the 1st New Hampshire Regiment in the American Revolution, and he was at the Battle of Bennington, where he was wounded. In between the wars, Dartmouth College was founded, 1769, in New Hampshire on the Connecticut River. Its mission was to train Indians as Protestant ministers. Its charter says, "For the education and instruction of youth of the Indian tribes in this land, in reading, writing, and all parts of learning, which shall appear necessary and expedient for civilizing and Christianizing children of pagans, as well as in all liberal arts and sciences, and also of English youth, and any others." Well, Lieutenant Thomas Smith's great-grandson, David Campbell Smith, was born in Francistown, New Hampshire, and he graduated from Dartmouth College in 1813, the first of any of my ancestors that I know of to attend any college. David Campbell Smith married Harriet Mitchell of Haverhill. She was my ancestor Hannah Bradley's great-granddaughter. They were married in 1820 and they moved out to Ohio, where he was a judge. David Smith was a judge in Columbus for several years. Interestingly enough, David Campbell Smith's great-grandson, Joseph A. Gill, who was my great-grandfather, was a judge in Indian Territory, 1889 to 1907. Now let's turn to the McClintocks, the last of the 3 families to immigrate. The McClintocks traditionally lived on the bonny banks of Loch Lomond in Scotland. At least from the 1500s, maybe before. They were well established as a family, but they weren't prominent enough to be a clan. They joined their landlords in the settlement of Ulster. They were at Raphoe in County Donegal. The McClintocks are listed in the militia rolls of Raphoe in 1630. Since they were in the militia, it's a pretty safe bet that they took part in putting down the Irish Rebellion of 1689, and they may have been actually in the Siege of Londonderry. Once the Scotch-Irish migration began, William McClintock emigrated from Northern Ireland in the 1730s, and he came to Litchfield, New Hampshire. In 1744, he moved to Chester. By 1775, he had gone west to Hillsborough, New Hampshire. This is kind of a common trait with Scotch-Irish families in America, that they would move basically every generation or so. The McClintocks, William McClintock, the immigrant, had a son, James. James and a woman named Hepzibah, not sure of her last name, definitely not sure how to spell her first name because nobody spelled it the same way twice, so they all called her Hepsy. James and Hepsy were married in 1803 in Hillsborough. They moved out to western New York State, and they settled at Phelps in Ontario County up near Lake Ontario in 1814. They bought a number of parcels of land there from 1814 up through 1829. A couple of interesting occurrences while they lived there at Phelps. One was the Erie Canal. They broke ground for the Erie Canal at Albany in 1817. They had driven it west past the McClintock Farms in 1823. It actually had cut through part of one of the properties. And they completed it to Buffalo in 1825 opening up commerce from the Great Lakes clear to the Hudson River and New York City and the Atlantic. Another big event in the town next to my folks' farms was that an angel appeared to Joseph Smith in 1823 and instructed him where to dig up the golden plates whereon was inscribed the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon and had it published there in Palmyra in 1830. My family left the area in 1832. They were following some of their children, their older children, who had moved out to Bainbridge, Ohio, near Cleveland, earlier, and presently the family was all in Bainbridge. William McClintock, my ancestor, was the grandson of the immigrant William McClintock. He was born in New York. He moved with his parents to Ohio, and when he grew up, he went farther west to Iowa. He was a lawyer and newspaper publisher in West Union, Iowa, for many years. Judge David Smith's great-granddaughter, Edna Gill, married James McClintock's great-grandson, Roy M. McClintock, in 1910. One result of their happy union was my mother, Nancy McClintock Goddard, born in 1916. And that's the story of one part of my family history.